What if the person you show to the world every single day is only half of who you actually are? What if somewhere underneath the personality you have carefully built, the one that is appropriate, acceptable and socially safe, there is another version of you? One that is wilder, more honest, more complex, carrying things you have never said out loud and feelings you have never fully let yourself feel. What if that hidden side is not something to be afraid of but something that holds the key to everything you have been searching for? Carl Jung believed this with everything he had. And he spent his entire life building a map of the hidden territory of the human mind, a map so detailed and so profound that 100 years later, psychologists, philosophers, artists, and thinkers are still using it to understand themselves and the people around them. Today we are going to walk through that map together. Not in the language of academic textbooks. Not in terms designed to impress rather than illuminate. In plain, honest language that you can take into your actual life and use. Because Jung did not build these ideas for institutions. He built them for people. For anyone willing to look honestly at the full picture of who they are, the light and the shadow, the known and the unknown, the person the world sees and the person only you know exists. Stay with me. This one goes deep. Let us start with the part of Jung's work that most people recognize immediately because most people are living it without knowing it has a name. Jung called it the persona. The persona is the version of yourself you present to the outside world. It is not fake exactly. It contains real parts of you. But it is curated. Edited. Shaped over years by what your family rewarded, what your culture approved of, what your environment made safe to express. It is the professional self you bring to work. The composed self you bring to family gatherings. The funny self you bring to social situations. The strong self you show when you are actually falling apart inside. Jung borrowed the word from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. Because that is essentially what the persona is, a mask. Not a dishonest one necessarily. But a mask nonetheless. The problem is not that the persona exists. Every functioning human being needs one. Social life requires us to adapt our behavior to different contexts. That is not inauthenticity. That is navigation. The problem Jung identified is when a person becomes so identified with their persona that they forget it is a mask at all. When the role you play becomes the only self you know. When you perform the character so consistently that you lose access to everything underneath it. Jung called this persona inflation, and he believed it was one of the most common sources of midlife crisis, existential emptiness, and the feeling that despite having everything that was supposed to make you happy, something fundamental is still missing. Because what is missing is you. The real you. The one underneath the mask. And no amount of external success can fill that absence. This is the part of Jung's work that changes people. The concept that, once you understand it, you cannot unsee in yourself or in anyone around you. Jung called it the shadow. The shadow is the part of yourself that you have rejected. Suppressed. Denied. Hidden not just from other people but from yourself. It is not simply your dark side in the way popular culture talks about it. It is more specific than that. The shadow is formed through a very particular process. When you were young, you learned through the reactions of parents, teachers, peers, society which parts of you were acceptable and which were not. The anger was too much. The neediness was embarrassing. The ambition was arrogant. The sensitivity was weakness. The sexuality was shameful. The grief was inconvenient. And so, piece by piece, you took the parts of yourself that were not welcomed and you put them somewhere out of sight. You did not destroy them. You cannot destroy parts of yourself. You simply pushed them into the dark where they could not cause trouble. Jung called that place the shadow. And here is the crucial thing Jung understood that most people never grasp. What you put in the shadow does not stay quietly in the shadow. It finds other ways out. It comes out as the disproportionate anger you feel toward a certain kind of person. It comes out in the intense judgment you have toward behaviors in others that, if you looked carefully, reflect something you have refused to acknowledge in yourself. It comes out in recurring patterns you cannot explain, the same argument with different people, the same kind of relationship that ends the same way, the same self-sabotage that shows up every time you get close to something you want. Jung said, and this is one of the most important things he ever wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Read that again. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. The things you have never examined are running the show. The shadow you have never acknowledged is making decisions you think you are making freely. And every time the pattern repeats, you wonder why this keeps happening to you, not realizing that the answer lives in the part of yourself you have never been willing to look at. Shadow work has become a popular term. It is everywhere in wellness spaces and self-improvement circles. But it is often misunderstood, reduced to journaling prompts and aesthetic content about going inward. Jung's idea of shadow work was more rigorous than that. And more honest. It begins with a simple but deeply uncomfortable practice: noticing your projections. A projection, in Jungian psychology, is when you take something from your own shadow and place it onto someone else. You see in them what you cannot tolerate seeing in yourself. The person who judges others for being arrogant is often carrying unacknowledged pride. The person who cannot stand selfishness in others is often suppressing their own needs to the point of resentment. The person who is most vocal about a particular behavior is sometimes fighting that exact impulse in themselves. This is not always true. Sometimes a judgment is just a judgment. But Jung's invitation is to pause at the moments of strongest reaction, especially when a particular person or behavior provokes something disproportionate in you, and ask the honest question. What is this showing me about myself? That question is not easy. It requires a kind of brutal honesty that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. But it is also one of the most liberating questions you can ask. Because every time you reclaim a piece of your shadow, every time you acknowledge a part of yourself you had hidden away, you get a piece of your energy back. The energy it took to suppress that part of yourself is freed. And it becomes available for something creative, something generative, something real. Jung believed that the shadow, once integrated, becomes one of the greatest sources of vitality a person has. Because what you have been fighting inside yourself stops costing you and starts serving you. Jung identified something else inside the unconscious that most people have never considered. He believed that within every person, regardless of gender, lives an inner figure of the opposite psychological energy. He called the feminine principle within a man the anima, and the masculine principle within a woman the animus. Now, before this sounds abstract, let me make it concrete. Jung was not talking about gender in the biological or social sense. He was talking about psychological qualities that cultures have historically associated with the feminine and masculine, and the way those qualities live in all of us, regardless of how we identify. The anima represents qualities like intuition, emotional depth, receptivity, creativity, and connection to the inner world. The animus represents qualities like logic, directness, structure, assertiveness, and decisive action. Jung believed that a psychologically whole person has access to both. That the man who has never developed his anima is cut off from his emotional life, his intuition, his capacity for genuine intimacy. And the woman who has never developed her animus struggles with self-assertion, with trusting her own thinking, with taking decisive action in the world. And crucially, Jung believed that when these inner figures are not consciously developed, they get projected outward. The man who has not developed his anima projects it onto women, falling in love not with the actual person but with the image of everything he has not developed in himself. The woman who has not developed her animus projects it onto men, seeking in a partner the strength or authority or decisiveness she has not claimed in herself. This is why certain relationships feel fated or magical at first and then collapse under the weight of impossible expectations. Because you were not relating to a person. You were relating to a projection of your own undeveloped inner life. Developing the anima or animus means consciously cultivating what you have outsourced. Developing your emotional life if you have lived purely in logic. Developing your capacity for structure and action if you have lived purely in feeling. Becoming more whole inside so that you stop needing other people to carry the parts of yourself you have not yet claimed. At the center of Jung's entire framework is a concept he called the self with a capital S. Not the ego. Not the persona. Not any particular part of who you are. But the totality. The whole person, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, unified and integrated into something complete. Jung believed that every human being has a deep, largely unconscious drive toward this wholeness. He called the process of moving toward it individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement in the conventional sense. It is not about becoming more productive or more successful or more socially appealing. It is about becoming more fully yourself, including the parts of yourself that are inconvenient, complicated, or difficult to acknowledge. It is the work of a lifetime. Not a weekend retreat or a phase of therapy or a period of intense self-reflection. A lifetime. Because the unconscious is vast and the process of bringing it into conscious relationship with who you are is never finished. But Jung believed, and his life's work demonstrated, that the more a person moves toward individuation, the more they experience a particular quality of life that is hard to describe but immediately recognizable. A sense of being in the right place. Of acting from something genuine rather than something performed. Of relationships that feel real rather than transactional. Of work that means something. Of a life that, even with all its difficulty, feels fundamentally aligned with something true about who you are. That is what is on the other side of the hidden work. Not perfection. Not the absence of struggle. But authenticity. And in a world full of personas and performances and carefully managed impressions, authenticity is one of the rarest and most valuable things a human being can offer. How to use Jung's ideas in your actual life. Let us bring this out of the philosophical and into the practical. Because Jung's ideas are only as valuable as your ability to use them. The first practice is to watch your strongest reactions. When someone or something provokes a disproportionate response in you, strong judgment, intense irritation, deep envy, unexpected admiration, pause and ask what that reaction might be reflecting about you. Not always. But often enough to be worth the question. The second practice is to notice recurring patterns. If the same kind of relationship keeps ending the same way. If the same kind of conflict keeps appearing with different people. If the same opportunity keeps being sabotaged by the same behavior, that pattern is almost certainly being driven by something unconscious. Something in the shadow that has not been looked at yet. The third practice is to pay attention to your dreams. Jung believed dreams were one of the primary languages of the unconscious. Not to be interpreted literally but symbolically. The figures that appear in your dreams, the situations that repeat, the emotions that surface in sleep, these are the unconscious communicating in the only language available to it when the conscious mind is quiet. You do not need to become an expert in dream analysis. But keeping a journal and sitting with the question of what a dream might be reflecting about your inner life is a surprisingly productive practice. The fourth practice is to cultivate what you have neglected. If you are someone who lives entirely in logic, deliberately develop your emotional life. If you are someone who lives entirely in feeling, deliberately develop your capacity for structure and rational thinking. Not to abandon what comes naturally but to become more whole. Because the most fully alive people are not the ones who have perfected one side of themselves. They are the ones who have developed enough range to meet life in all its complexity. Carl Jung spent his life looking into the hidden side of the human mind. And what he found there was not a monster. It was a person. The full person. The complete person. The one that exists underneath all the performance and all the protection and all the carefully managed impressions. He found the shadow not as something to be ashamed of but as something to be reclaimed. He found the persona not as something to be destroyed but as something to be held lightly, as a tool rather than an identity. He found the inner figures we project outward and invited us to develop them within ourselves instead. And he found the self, the wholeness we are all unconsciously moving toward, whether we know it or not. The hidden side of your mind is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has been waiting the longest to be seen. To be acknowledged. To be brought into the light, not so that it can be fixed but so that it can finally be integrated into the full picture of who you are. And when that integration begins to happen, when you stop fighting yourself and start knowing yourself, something shifts that is very difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. You become less at war with yourself. Less reactive. Less driven by patterns you do not understand. Less dependent on the outside world to confirm who you are. More present. More genuine. More free. That is what the hidden work leads to. Not a perfect life. Not the absence of pain or conflict or confusion. But a real one. A life that is actually yours. If this opens something in you, share it with someone who is ready to look at themselves honestly. And if you are new here, welcome. Subscribe and hit the bell. We go deep on psychology, self-understanding, and the kind of thinking that actually changes how you live. See you next tomorrow.